Imagine this. It is an ordinary Wednesday morning, the kind of morning where nothing seems about to change. In Washington, D.C., American officials are drinking their coffee and reading their briefings. In Beijing, Chinese military analysts are at their desks, running their daily assessments. In Islamabad, Pakistani generals are in their morning strategy meetings. And in New Delhi, something is happening that none of these rooms are fully prepared for. Not a war, not a crisis, not a diplomatic breakdown. Something quieter than all of those things, and far more powerful. India is moving. Not its army, not its navy, not its air force. All three, simultaneously, along with its space assets, its cyber capabilities, its diplomatic network, and its economy. All moving together in one direction with one purpose. In a single 72-hour window that would later be studied in military academies, foreign policy institutes, and intelligence agencies around the world for years to come. India sent a message that morning, not in words, in actions. Actions so precisely calibrated, so simultaneously executed, and so strategically layered that three of the world's most powerful nations, America, China, and Pakistan, each looked up from their morning routines and felt something they were not accustomed to feeling: surprise. The world believed India was a reactive nation, a nation that responded to pressure but never initiated it, a nation that complained loudly but moved slowly, a nation whose size and complexity made bold, coordinated, simultaneous action almost impossible. They were wrong. And the day they discovered they were wrong is the day that India's place in the global order permanently changed. Stay till the end, because the final move India made that day is the one that nobody talks about publicly, and it is the most powerful move of all. To understand what happened, you need to understand the pressure that had been building for months before that Wednesday morning. From the West, Pakistan had been escalating. Cross-border provocations, ceasefire violations, support for groups that were attacking Indian security forces in Kashmir. Pakistani military officials were making statements that were growing bolder and more aggressive. There was a sense in Islamabad that India was distracted, that India's political calendar and economic pressures had reduced its appetite for confrontation, that Pakistan could push harder than usual without serious consequences. That sense was a miscalculation. From the north, China was applying its own pressure. Chinese troops had been edging forward in disputed border areas. Infrastructure was being built on territory India considered its own. Chinese naval vessels were increasing their presence in the Indian Ocean, moving closer to India's island territories. Chinese diplomats were working to isolate India in international forums. And Chinese state media was running an intensifying campaign portraying India as weak, divided, and incapable of defending its interests. That campaign was also a miscalculation. And from across the Pacific, America was applying a different kind of pressure. Trade pressure, technology access pressure, demands for clearer strategic alignment. American officials were privately frustrated that India would not commit more openly to American positions on China and Russia. There was talk in Washington of recalibrating the relationship, of making India feel the cost of its strategic ambiguity. American pressure was more sophisticated than Pakistanis and more subtle than Chinese, but it was pressure nonetheless. Three directions, three different kinds of pressure, all arriving at roughly the same moment. And India's response was to do something none of the three expected. India did not respond to any one of them separately. India responded to all three simultaneously, on a Wednesday morning that nobody saw coming. But that was only the beginning, because what India did that morning had been planned for months, quietly, secretly, with a level of operational discipline that surprised even India's own allies. The first layer of India's response was military, and it began not with a battle, but with a demonstration.
India activated its nuclear submarine fleet. INS Arahant and INS Aragat both went to sea simultaneously. Two nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, both leaving port within hours of each other, both going dark, both disappearing into the depths of the Indian Ocean. This was not a routine patrol. The timing was deliberate. The departure was allowed to be observed by satellite imagery that Indian intelligence knew was being monitored. India wanted China and Pakistan to see the submarines leave. It wanted them to know that two nuclear-armed submarines were now somewhere in the ocean, somewhere they could not find. Somewhere from which India's nuclear response capability was completely safe from any first strike. The message was precise and unmistakable. Whatever you are planning, whatever pressure you think you are applying, India's ability to respond survives it. Do the mathematics. Within hours of the submarines going to sea, India activated its Agni missile systems. Not a launch, a movement. Agni 5 missiles, with their range of over 5,000 kilometers, enough to reach anywhere in China, were moved from their storage facilities to their deployment positions. Again, deliberately visible to satellites. Again, a message written not in words, but in movement. India is ready. India is awake. India is not distracted. Simultaneously, Indian Air Force assets were repositioned. Rafale fighter jets moved to forward bases in Ladakh, close to the Chinese border. Su-30 MKIs were deployed to bases facing Pakistan. AWACS aircraft, the airborne radar systems that give India eyes across an enormous area of sky, went into continuous rotation. India's air defense systems were switched to elevated readiness. The entire military ecosystem moved from routine to ready in a window so short that outside analysts struggled to believe the timeline when they later reconstructed it. This changed everything about how India's military coordination was perceived. Because the criticism of India's military for decades had been that its three services, the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force, operated in silos. That they planned separately, communicated poorly, and could not execute truly joint operations. That Wednesday morning proved the critics wrong. All three services moved together, as if operated by a single hand, as if the decades of effort to build joint operational capability had finally completely paid off. In Beijing, Chinese military analysts watching the satellite feeds and signals intelligence reports did something they rarely do. They called an emergency meeting, because what they were seeing did not match their model of Indian military behavior. Their model said India would respond slowly, would take days or weeks to fully activate, would move one service at a time, sequentially. Their model was wrong. And when your model is wrong in military planning, everything built on that model becomes uncertain. In Islamabad, the Pakistani generals in their morning meeting received their intelligence updates and went quiet. Because the Indian military posture they were seeing was not the posture of a distracted nation. It was the posture of a nation that had been watching, waiting, and preparing, and had chosen this moment deliberately to show that preparation. But no one expected what came next, because the military moves were just the first layer. The second layer was in space. India's ISRO and Defense Space Agency activated a coordinated set of satellite operations that India had been quietly preparing for months. India repositioned its intelligence-gathering satellites to provide continuous coverage of Pakistani military installations and Chinese border positions. India activated its NAVIC navigation satellite system, its own GPS equivalent, across its military platforms. This was significant because it meant India's military operations were no longer dependent on American GPS, no longer vulnerable to the possibility, however remote, that American GPS access could be restricted or degraded in a crisis. India was navigating with its own satellites, seeing with its own eyes, communicating through its own space infrastructure. The strategic independence this represented was enormous, and it was not lost on Washington. Because one of America's quiet leverages over allied and partner militaries is their dependence on American space infrastructure, GPS, satellite communications, intelligence sharing. Nations that depend on American systems are nations that must maintain relationships with America on terms that preserve that access.
India was demonstrating that it had built, quietly and completely, an alternative, that India could fight, navigate, communicate, and see without American permission or American infrastructure. That message was aimed directly at Washington, not aggressively, not as a threat, but as information, a clear, undeniable statement of fact. India has options, India has independence, and India's cooperation with America is a choice, not a necessity. And choices made freely are more valuable than dependencies managed reluctantly. Washington received that message. 4 economic announcements, 4 targeted messages, all delivered on the same morning as the military and space moves. The combination was overwhelming in its sophistication, because suddenly every capital that was applying pressure on India had to deal not just with one unexpected Indian response in their domain, but with a coordinated, multi-domain Indian response that touched military, space, and economic dimensions simultaneously. Pakistan had to think about submarines it could not find and missiles it could see moving. China had to think about an Indian military that had moved faster and more cohesively than its models predicted, while also watching trade networks being built that would reduce Chinese regional leverage. America had to absorb the demonstration of Indian space independence while simultaneously processing economic announcements designed to show that India was choosing cooperation rather than being compelled into it. 3 audiences, 3 messages, all delivered at once. This is what strategic communication at the highest level looks like, and India had just delivered a masterclass in it. Now let us talk about the reactions, because the reactions told their own story. China's response was the most carefully calibrated. Beijing said nothing publicly for 48 hours. In Chinese strategic culture, silence is often the most meaningful response. It means the leadership is genuinely recalculating, genuinely uncertain about how to respond. When China did speak, its tone was markedly different from the aggressive rhetoric of the preceding months. Suddenly, Chinese officials were talking about dialogue, about the importance of stable relations with India, about mutual respect and shared interests. The infrastructure encroachment in the border areas slowed. The Chinese naval vessels in the Indian Ocean maintained their distance, not because China had suddenly become friendly, but because China had reassessed and found that the India it had been pressuring was not the India it had assumed it was dealing with. Pakistan's response was more immediate and more emotional. Pakistani military spokespersons made statements. Pakistani media ran agitated coverage. There was noise, but there was no escalation. Because behind the noise, the Pakistani military establishment was having a private conversation that was much quieter and much more sober than its public statements. The private conversation was about capability, about whether Pakistani assumptions regarding Indian military response timelines had been accurate. They had not been, and recalibrating those assumptions had serious implications for Pakistani strategic planning that would take months to work through. America's reaction was the most interesting of the 3, because America's reaction was not anger, it was respect, mixed with something that Washington rarely feels about India: concern. Not concerning in an adversarial sense, concern in the sense of, we need to update our understanding of this partner. We need to recognize that this is not a nation we can manage. This is a nation we need to engage with differently. Senior American officials reached out to their Indian counterparts not to complain about the rupee settlement announcements or the demonstration of GPS independence, but to talk, to understand, to begin, quietly, a new kind of conversation, one that America initiates with very few nations on Earth.
The conversation that starts with, what do you need and how do we build something that works for both of us? That conversation itself was a victory for India, not on any battlefield, but in the room where global power is actually allocated. The room where decisions are made about which nations matter, which nations are consulted, which nations are factored into the biggest calculations about the world's future. India had just moved further into that room than it had ever been before, and it had done so in 72 hours. Now let us zoom out and understand what this moment truly represented.
For 75 years since independence, India operated in a world built by others, a world where the rules were written in Washington and enforced through American power, where the economic architecture was designed in Bretton Woods and maintained through dollar dominance, where the technology standards were set in Silicon Valley, where the security frameworks were drawn in NATO headquarters. India navigated this world as best it could, sometimes successfully, sometimes frustratingly, always aware that it was operating within a system it had not designed and did not control. But something has been changing, slowly at first, then faster. Then, on one Wednesday morning, all at once, India demonstrated that it had built, piece by piece over decades, an independent capacity to act, to move militarily without dependence on any ally's permission, to see and navigate through its own space infrastructure, to build economic relationships on its own terms, to send messages to 3 different global powers simultaneously and have each message land precisely where it was aimed. This is not the behavior of a nation operating within someone else's system. This is the behavior of a nation that has built its own, not a competing system, not a hostile alternative, but an independent capacity that gives India choices that it never had before. And choice is power, the most fundamental kind of power. The power that says, we are here because we choose to be, not because we have no other options, not because we are dependent on your goodwill, but because this serves our interests. And when it stops serving our interests, we will find another way. That power is what India demonstrated on that Wednesday morning. And here is the final truth. The most powerful thing India did that day was something that appeared in no satellite image, that triggered no alarm in any intelligence agency, that was reported by no journalist and analyzed by no think tank. India did not blink. At any point in those 72 hours, as pressure came from 3 directions simultaneously, as the weight of 3 major powers pushing against Indian interests reached its maximum point, India did not flinch, did not seek reassurance, did not make panicked calls to allies asking for support, did not look for a face-saving way to de-escalate that required giving something up. India simply moved, calmly, deliberately, on its own timeline, with its own plan. And that stillness, that unshakable, deep-rooted confidence in its own capacity and its own judgment, was the most powerful signal of all. Because nations that have genuinely arrived at the first rank of global power share one characteristic above all others. They know who they are, they know what they are capable of, and they do not need anyone else's validation to act on that knowledge. India knew who it was on that Wednesday morning. It had known for some time. It was simply showing the rest of the world what it had always known about itself, that this is a civilization of 1.4 billion people and 5,000 years of continuity, that has survived every empire that tried to erase it, every power that tried to limit it, every doubt that tried to define it, and that is now, finally, completely and permanently operating on its own terms. America was shocked. China was recalculating. Pakistan was reconsidering. And India was already moving on to the next thing. Because that is what powers do. They do not stop to celebrate being noticed. They keep building, keep moving, keep becoming more of what they already are. India kept moving, and the world learned to keep watching.